So first I call upon our university Jewish chaplain, Rabbi Meir Mitelman, to offer an opening prayer. As many of you know, Monroe's understanding of ethics and life in general was very much influenced by his Judaism, and over the years, his friend and university colleague, Rabbi Meir, was one of those with whom he shared his religious ethics. So, Rabbi Meir.
Just a few words before the memorial prayer. As a rabbi of Hofstra Law, the Center for Jewish Life on campus, I had the honor and privilege of knowing Monroe since my earliest years at Hofstra in the mid-1980s. The choice of Monroe as an honoree at our Hillel's annual dinner last year was an expression of our students' and staff's deep appreciation of his enthusiastic, devoted support of a vibrant Jewish community at Hofstra. Monroe's expertise in legal ethics and his passionate commitment to pursuing justice reflected his wholehearted dedication to two foundations of Jewish values: living ethically and healing a fractured world. And he was a mensch par excellence. The Yiddish word mensch, the highest accolade you can give someone, is not easy to translate into English, but basically it means a genuinely fine, caring, thoughtful, good, honest person with outstanding character and values. May his memory always be a blessing and inspiration to his family, friends, colleagues, students, and teachers. Please rise for an English rendering of the traditional Jewish memorial prayer. O God, full of mercy, who dwells on high, grant complete repose under the wings of your divine presence to the soul of our beloved Monroe Freedman, who has gone to his eternal home. May he join the company of the holy and pure ones who shine as bright as the firmament. Lord of mercy, shelter Monroe under your wings for eternity, and may you bind his soul into the bond of life. With you as his heritage, may he rest in peace. And let us say, Amen.
I'm Eric Lane, the Dean of the Maurice A. Deane School of Law at Hofstra University, and I want to welcome all of you to our remembrance of Professor Monroe Freedman, who passed away last February. We are so pleased that so many of you have taken the time to come to Hofstra to share memories of Monroe and to offer a tip of the hat in tribute to the extraordinary life of Monroe Freedman. A family man, a Jew, a teacher, a mentor, a scholar, an activist, and a wonderful colleague. Just accomplishing what Monroe did in the field of legal ethics would have been enough success for most of us, but not for Monroe. He was on a mission. As our former dean and now president, Stuart Rabinowitz, said last year, a mission to instill in all of us his passionate belief that through law and social action we could improve the lives of everyone. This is his story, and it is that story that we plan to tell tonight. I will start with my part. When I was hired by Monroe 39, now 40 years ago, he gave me two directives, which have been my guiding principle throughout my career at Hofstra as both professor and dean. Be a great teacher and make a difference. No person that I know has embodied these ideals both personally and professionally better than Monroe Freedman. My last memory of Monroe is a discussion we had only a month or so before he died. It was about a plan he had to celebrate and teach about the powerful role lawyers have played, and of course, in Monroe's unshakable view, should play in our ever-going struggle for social and civil justice. Before his illness brought it to an end, he had already started a class on this subject in which many extraordinary lawyers were to appear, including his longtime friend, co-author, and as she has called herself, his intellectual wife, Abby Smith, who will be speaking later this evening. And he was excited also to have started planning a book on this topic with a Hofstra colleague, Jen Gunlack, who will also be offering some remarks later. And as I listened to him, I could only think of how tall and dignified and smart and caring and filled with humor and curiosity he was, as he always was. And this, despite the incredible weight of loss that had settled on his shoulders over the last many years through the loss of his beloved wife, Audrey, and two of his children, Caleb and Sarah. How could he do all this? What an extraordinary man. Monroe Freedman, what an extraordinary man. A life well lived, a guide for us all. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our former dean and now university president, Stuart Rabinowitz.
This is a gifted child. First, this child tells the rabbi to stick to the benediction and stop with the speeches. And now the child tells me, he's excited I'm about to speak. All right. So it really is an honor and a pleasure to be here tonight to celebrate the life and career of Monroe. It's also a particular pleasure for me to be in front of so many of my former students who I probably remember better than people I spoke to yesterday. We really all grew up together, and to see you come back here and express your appreciation of Monroe is very moving to me. I know I probably will offend a whole bunch of you, because you're all terrific, but I do want to especially recognize one of my former students who is here today, who was one of the very best students I ever had. Now, I know 40 of you are now waiting for your name to be called. But I want to say a special welcome to the person in whose name this law school is named, and express my appreciation for the generosity of Maurice Deane. Maurice, thank you. I shouldn't tell this story, but I'll tell it anyway. But, at one point, Monroe asked me to join him in a law firm with practicing law with Maurice Deane. And Maurice Deane's role was to provide the money while Monroe and I would do the legal work. But we stayed. We didn't do that. We tried. We tried, yes. So we all know Monroe was a legal giant, and sometimes it's when you work so closely with somebody day in and day out, it's hard to really take a step back and appreciate it, that you are working with a legal giant. But Monroe is. His name will go down forever as the father of the study of American legal ethics. He was a prolific and thoughtful and a very provocative scholar. He was an advocate, as you heard from Eric Lane, for social justice, and he was a great teacher. Monroe, what I remember most about his early years as dean was how interested he really was in law students, both prospective and enrolled, and how ahead of his time again, and Monroe had this habit of always being ahead of his time, he felt that the LSATs were a poor and even a biased indicator of who would be a good lawyer. And so instead of just whining and complaining about it, what he did was he spent innumerable hours personally interviewing applicants who would not have been admitted but for his taking the time to try to find out their life story and the real promise each had in terms of the legal profession. And there are many successful alumni here and around the country who really owe their successful legal careers to Monroe's intervention. Shortly after Monroe joined Hofstra, he asked me to serve as his associate dean. Naturally, he didn't just appoint me. The Monroe style, he had an election. He had a faculty election. That's the first and last time any dean ever had an election for their associate dean. So anyway, he asked, somehow I won the election. So he asked me to serve as his associate dean, and that began my descent into the administrative side of the House. And in some way, he's indirectly responsible for my later attaining the deanship and now hitting rock bottom as president. I learned a lot from my time as Monroe's associate because, as you might expect, he paid no attention to the details. Monroe was a charismatic leader. He was a big picture guy. He wasn't a detail person. He did not micromanage, and that's an understatement. But what he did do was give me the room to grow and develop, to learn the ropes from the bottom up. Monroe was a strong believer, however, in the importance of personal connections, hosting every year parties at the beginning of the year for the entire faculty in his home. That's how we viewed the semester as beginning at Monroe's house the Sunday before classes began. He also invited his students to sign up for lunches with him, where they would continue to discuss challenging legal issues in a smaller and more personal environment. Even though he was serving as dean inside and outside, he continued to teach, and Monroe was an extraordinary professor. Even in his large classes, he cared so much about his students that he learned their names, addressing each as Mr. or Mrs. with the Ms. or Mrs. with the appropriate name. And so after his death, one student posted on the law school page the following quote: "After reviewing a class seating chart and conducting one class, he could remember each student without reference to the chart. Many years after law school, I was eating lunch in a Japanese restaurant in Washington, D.C. 3 men entered the restaurant. One was Lawrence Tribe, the other was unknown to me, and the third was Monroe. As the men were waiting to be seated, I looked at him briefly and wondered if he would recall me if I introduced myself to him. Before I could do so, he looked back at me, smiled, and said, 'Good afternoon, Mr. Insera.' Monroe was and continues to be an inspiration. In his classes, we all have our different style. In his classes, Monroe was truly Socratic. Some say as Socratic could be. He taught his students to think about the importance of every word in an opinion, as well as about the policy choices that each such word embodied. He truly taught his students to think like lawyers. I know that's a phrase or a concept which some people think is now old-fashioned, but which I still believe is at the core of an excellent legal education. Monroe's students, and that's the test, were prepared for the courtroom or the boardroom, having learned critical skills of careful reading, the ability to get to the heart of a problem, to analyze with intelligence and creativity, and to advocate with the most persuasive arguments possible. Of course, legal ethics were infused in all of Monroe's courses from the very start, particularly in his contracts class, where Monroe, again, as usual, was well ahead of the curve in spotting ethical issues in a host of bargaining contexts and negotiations. Of course, Monroe is quirky. I mean, let's face it. Monroe had his quirks. So one of his quirks, I consider it a quirk, is that he would tell his students they could not believe the truth of any statement he made in class unless he said it at least 3 times during the semester. Now, I get the goal of that. His goal was to encourage skepticism about everything, even to discourage students from assuming that professorial edict should be exempt from challenge. But it used to drive the first-year students crazy. I would overhear them in the lounge. There were arguments about how many times did he say it, and did he use the exact same words, so maybe that's only 2 times he said it. And then, of course, there were Monroe's grades. Okay, Monroe was the hardest grader in the history of legal education. I haven't researched that, but I'm pretty sure that's true. He was extraordinarily difficult grader. He used to say that C was a good grade. Yes, C was a good grade. Anything above that was exceptional in his mind. But if you were a student and you received an A from Monroe Freedman, you knew you had done something very, very special. One student, again, posted on our webpage, the A I got from Monroe, I consider to be the absolutely greatest academic achievement of my life. So I could go on and on about Monroe's career, but I won't, since there are many other speakers to address his many attributes. Suffice it to say that he was a man of vision, and he was an extraordinary and energetic educator. He was a brilliant advocate and practitioner of the law, a man of enormous integrity, and he had a special kind of genius. I can't define it, but it was a special kind of genius that not only he revealed to us during his lifetime, but will inspire us for many years to come. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Susan Fortney, and I'm the former Lichtenstein Professor of Legal Ethics and the Director of the Institute for the Study of Legal Ethics, which now fittingly is called the Monroe Freedman Institute for Legal Ethics, which I think is thanks to all of you that supported that, spearheaded by our dean and supported by our president. So thank you all, and I'm looking forward to seeing many great things come out of that institute. It's good for me to be back at Hofstra to see old friends, students, colleagues, and I'm especially honored to be here this evening and to join others in reflecting on both the life and influence of Monroe. It's hard to call him Monroe Freedman because we all loved him so. It was often Monroe among his colleagues. And I think my piece of this will to share some thoughts related to his work in the legal ethics world. And without doubt, as others have mentioned, he was clearly a professional responsibility guru. I mean, there's all sorts of references to him in terms of being the dean and father of legal ethics. Alan Dershowitz, for example, referred to him as the father of modern legal ethics as an academic field. And I could spend my allotted few minutes really talking about his many contributions to legal ethics. But rather than doing that, I'd like to just briefly reflect on his role as an ethical leader. This was touched on by our president, how he was a leader that could be considered a servant leader. In the last few years, there have been a number of books that have been written about ethical leadership and servant leadership. And for me, Monroe's face would be on the front of those books. I think in each realm of his personal and professional life that he personified an ethical leader, a servant leader. As our president mentioned, he was someone that did not lead from the top down. It really was his persona, and I think his persona is what has inspired so many of us. When I think of servant leadership, there's different quotes, and one that I came up with that is now being referred to a great deal is by a professor who writes about professional identity, Professor Neil Hamilton. And this is what Neil said about a servant leader. A servant leader elevates others' priority needs, helping others to reach their potential and their better selves. And when it comes to decisions, the servant leader asks, what is the effect on the least privileged in society? Well, I think each of us could say how that really was something that Monroe did and inspired us to think about. So we can all reflect on how Monroe inspired us to become better people and influenced how we treat others. Working with his students, colleagues, clients, I think he clearly was dedicated to the growth and success of others. I saw it when I visited his classes. I mean, I wanted to see what really the guru does in his legal ethics class. So from the first semester that I was here, I would visit his classes, and it was a joy, because it was a joy to see the way that he engaged his students. He challenged his students. He didn't settle for second best, excuse me. And above all, I loved it when there was this spark in his eyes when students would get it, and a spark in his eyes when I think some of the colleagues would eventually get it, sometimes in faculty meetings. There on our website, on the Hofstra website, you'll see many tributes and reflections on the way that Monroe influenced people, supported and mentored them. And I remember one in particular, because this was a person who started out as a client. So it's Professor Janice McDonald, who had, oh, she's here. I just called you to Atlanta. I've been calling you. So here she is. Well, do you tell, may I do this? I loved your story. So,
When it's our turn, I can.
okay. Well, the short version that you put online, and welcome back to New York, because I see you're in Atlanta. So the Professor McDonald, I'm just tickled that you're here. Professor McDonald talked about being a client, that she was arrested on the steps of Capitol Hill, and that Monroe represented her, encouraged her to go to law school, that she now is continuing good work in running this cold case project. And there's many other people who have reflected on what Monroe did. Dean Vischer of St. Thomas Law School talked about being a baby law professor, and Monroe didn't know him, and he didn't send his work to Monroe, but out of the blue, Monroe wrote him very thoughtful comments that continue to inform his scholarship to this day. And in the world of legal ethics and professional identity as well, Dean Vischer continues to do great work. And so I just will close with thinking about how we can continue, as the president said, Monroe's good work. And I think we do it by thinking of how we can also be servant leaders. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's a real privilege to be here. I'm Roy Simon, and I was Monroe's colleague and friend at Hofstra for 19 years. I followed him as the Lichtenstein Distinguished Professor of Legal Ethics, and that meant a great deal to me because I was following Monroe, because that was the professorship that he had held. Monroe was just an extraordinary colleague and a loyal friend and a professional role model. He was one of the main reasons that I came to Hofstra. I didn't know a whole lot about Hofstra in 1992, but I knew the name Monroe Freedman because he was so prolific in the field. And it was a great decision to come here and work with him. Now, I only want to talk about two things. There are a lot of things I want to talk about, but I'm going to talk about two things. One is the legal ethics conferences that Monroe conceived of and that we organized, and the other is his classroom teaching, which I think is a pretty constant theme because he was such an excellent teacher. I had been at Hofstra for about 5 days, and my stuff was still in boxes, and I was in a temporary office, and I was working on some old, I think it was a 486, pre-Pentium computer. Nobody in the audience except the grayheads even knows that the Pentium was the latest and greatest, but I was working on this computer, and Monroe came into the office, and he said, "I have an idea I want to talk to you about." Okay. He said, "I think we should put on a major legal ethics conference." I said, okay. I had no idea what went into organizing a conference. He said, "I think we should invite the best names in the profession, and we should have a 2 or 3 day legal ethics conference, and we should pay a substantial honorarium to attract people and make it worth their while to really invest in writing papers and so on. And we should have the first one, this is 1992, we should have the first one in 1995. And that'll give us 3 years to plan. So I thought, wow, that's like the furthest out I've, even yogurt doesn't go that far out. And he said, and then, we should do this every 2 or 3 years. We should have another conference. And that way, we'll have 2 or 3 years to plan and to raise the funding and to convince the dean that this is something that we should be doing. And I mean, Monroe was just a person of big ideas. He was a person of action. And here he was, I'd been here 5 days, and he was looking, 10 years ahead. And that's what happened. We organized the conference, and Monroe was a magnet for, he called Alan Dershowitz. Oh, sure, Alan would come. Jeff Hazard would come. Chuck Wolfram would come. Many, many names, including Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So we planned this whole conference. I guess I should leave out the footnote about how the secretaries went on strike in 1995, so late that some people still showed up for the conference despite our calls, our FedExes, et cetera. But we had the conference in 1996, and then we had it in 1998, and 2001, 2003, 5, 7. We did 9. We did 7 conferences together, and they were all these huge, 2 or 3 day conferences where there was lots of time for people to talk with each other, the people who were attending. And I remember that our president, then Deane, went down to Washington and met with the U.S. news people, and you said all they wanted to know about is tell us more about these legal ethics conferences. So they made a big impact, and that was all, Monroe's idea. Classroom teaching. I asked Monroe if I could come to his class and, what would be a good day. Come anytime. He said, just come anytime, just show up. You don't need to tell me you're coming. So I went, I don't know, I must have gone to at least a dozen of his classes over the years, and he just had this subtle style that I could never copy. He would tell a little anecdote or show a film clip or get the idea, some idea out there, and then just ask the students what it meant. What did they make of it? What were their reactions? And the hands would start to go up. How many of you had Monroe as your professor for legal ethics? Okay, or for contracts. Let's, good. A lot of people. And students occasionally would come up to me and say, they would have some question they wanted to ask me about legal ethics, and they'd say, I'm sorry I didn't take your course. I took Monroe Freedman's course. I said, listen, if I had a choice between Simon and Freedman, I would take Freedman also. So. And the discussion would get going, and students had tremendous respect for them because they could tell that he had not just written about legal ethics or studied legal ethics or written columns and so on. He really had lived legal ethics. He knew what he was talking about. He had practiced legal ethics. He had wrestled with all these different problems. And as his book with Abby Smith, he demonstrated in the class understanding legal ethics. And that's what the students got out of it, was real understanding of legal ethics. And one of the things that I thought was inspiring was a student would raise some point, and here was a man who was the father of the modern study of legal ethics and who had seen it all, written about it all, done it all, and you could see that the spark was sometimes not just because the students got it, but because they got something that he had never thought of. And so after 50 years, he was still learning and learning from his students, and because of that, they always learned, and the students loved him. Anyway, it was really a lucky break for me to teach alongside and learn alongside Monroe Freedman for 19 years at Hofstra and to keep up with him as a friend afterwards, and it's very fitting that we're having this celebration. Thank you.
So, as more and more people speak, poor Abby's going at the end here and is going to have nothing left to say, because you're going to see a common theme among many of us as we're all talking, which in many ways I think is the testament to the strength of his character. So I'm Jennifer Gunlock. I'm, I guess, the youngest colleague up here, and maybe knew him for the least amount of time, but definitely had a wonderful friendship with him. So 3 things stand out for me about Monroe. First, generosity, which is another theme that we've already heard a bit about. He was incredibly generous with his time, with his mind, and with his heart, as far as I was concerned. One of the things that you notice about the room here tonight is that we have multiple generations in the room. We have alumni, we have colleagues, we have scholars, practicing attorneys, judges, and I think that's a testament of his ability to befriend people of all ages. And we even have Chauncey, who's short of 2 years, right? So I think his friendships span decades, and many of the people who were his students became some of his closest friends. And I think that there's a reason for that. Monroe was one of the first faculty members to welcome me to Hofstra. I had, of course, heard of Monroe. And was coming here to teach legal ethics, but I had not ever met him, and I was this newbie, young professor, and I remember very vividly the day that he came into my office and sat down uninvited. He kind of walks in, sits down, and he said, "I hear we have a new teacher of legal ethics. What's your name?" And I had no idea who he was. I was very taken aback by this. And as some of you will probably understand, he proceeded to cross-examine me for a good, hour plus. But at the end of the conversation, he said, he didn't ask, he said, "Next week you're going to join me for lunch at my favorite Indian place off campus." And that was that. And luckily I didn't actually decline because I took that directive, and it became the start of a beautiful friendship for the two of us. He was, as people have already mentioned, incredibly encouraging, particularly to his younger colleagues who were not just teaching in the legal ethics field, but also who were coming in as just new professors into the school. As a scholar, as a lawyer, as a colleague, James Sample described him as Mickey Mantle. And he didn't have to take an interest in his younger colleagues, but he did so. And he did it in a way that was very human and very kind and very easy to, there would be moments even, after I had been friends with him for several years, where I would think, I can't believe I'm sitting here talking to Monroe Freedman. You would have those moments. And he always encouraged me to be a better teacher, to be an impactful scholar, to seek ways to increase and improve access to justice, which was so important. And, obviously he did 1,000 things. I often said to him, how are you writing 3 articles, talking at these conferences, teaching 2 classes, doing all of this stuff? And I met him in the later years of life and wasn't doing that even at my age. And despite that, he was really generous with students, as I'm sure many of you can attest to, that, Fortney Selby, who's here tonight, who's our director of the library, has started scanning the pictures of all of the student organizations that gave him awards through the years. And when Jamie, his son-in-law, and I were going through his office, we just found boxes. I mean, not only were there stuff on the walls, but just boxes of, I think, every student organization we've ever had at some point gave him an award because of how much he did for the students here. He always, contributed to PJF and would have these great, take a limo and come to a night of the opera with me. So he was great. He also obviously personally recruited students. One of the things that I did, which I learned from him, one of the ways that he would get to know his 100 contract students was I learned at some point that he would take them out for coffee or take them out for lunch in small groups. And so I started doing that myself as a way to get to know my students better outside of the classroom. Second, he was a lifelong learner, as has already been mentioned by some of our speakers. Anyone who corresponded with Monroe via email knows that he would often include these quotations at the bottom of his emails, often reflecting what I think was his mood about what was going on in the world at that moment. And his quotes literally ranged from Pope Francis to Michael Tiger. You know, that's pretty broad breadth. And of course, Lewis Carroll's The Jabberwocky, which I will get to later. And one that he used in his emails during the last month of his life, I was actually going back and looking at some of our correspondence from January, and one of the things he had at the bottom was, "Everything I ever had to know, I learned too late, and I'm still learning." And that was his own quote. I don't think it was from anywhere. And Monroe truly was, as Roy Simon mentioned, he was always learning. He embodied the idea that a commitment to learning should be embraced as one of our values as lawyers. He was a voracious reader. He had stacks of books in his apartment, in his house, in his office, and I think he truly read all of them. I mean, some of us have books on display. I think he really read all of them at least once. And I think he was addicted to the process of perpetual improvement, especially in his teaching. One of the things that I'm quite struck by is that not only was he inviting, you know, Susan and Roy, but myself. He would say, "Come to my class and tell me what you think." And I thought, who the heck am I to be telling him what kind of teacher he should be? And yet, you know, one would think that with close to 50 years of teaching that he had scored some experience points as far as that goes. But he would come out of it and say, you know, what did you think? How did I do that? How did that work? He would, we have faculty workshops on teaching. He'd come to every single one of them, well into his 80s, which I just thought was incredible. He also reminded me to have fun with teaching. He was one of the more creative teachers that I knew. I had come to him one year commenting to him that my students were struggling to understand the penultimate, what do you do with the lying client, as Abby and him have obviously talked about and thought about tremendously. And in fact, several of my students had expressed outrage after reading Monroe's famous article, The Professional Responsibility of the Criminal Defense Lawyer, The Three Hardest Questions. And so Monroe and I concocted this idea that he would come to my ethics class so that my students could put him on the stand and cross-examine him. And so they spent all of this, I said, you know, you really got to be prepared, guys. So they spent all this time preparing, and, you know, I think they did a pretty good job, all things considered. But when the day of the class came, and Monroe, in all of his stature, I think he was maybe 82 at the time, and elegance, cane in hand, comes in and sits himself down in front of them on this, you know, tall stool in the middle of the classroom. I knew they were going to be eaten alive, and they were. So in the last few weeks of his life, I was incredibly privileged to spend some very special moments with him, joining him for some simple lunches and dinners at his apartment. Susan joined us for one of those, and despite his weakened state, as evidence of his continued learning and thinking, his mind was operating on all cylinders. He, in the wake of the Eric Garner case, as many of you probably know, he crafted this magnificent op-ed piece about the need to appoint special prosecutors in cases where the police are charged with killings. So really right up until the end. So finally, commitment to justice, as was mentioned by Dean Lane. Monroe and I shared a deep belief that lawyers have a professional responsibility to ensure not only access to our justice system, but to do what we can to make sure that it works for all people. And I think Monroe would appreciate if I ended with a line from Lewis Carroll's The Jabberwocky, as I think the mythical Jabberwock in that poem, in many ways, is illustrative of the ills that we see in our society and of the dysfunction that continues in our legal system. And I actually have the quote on my bulletin board as a reminder to always be on the lookout for those ills, which is something that he taught to me, and to take up the fight against them. So beware the Jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch. Beware the Jub-Jub bird and shun the frumious Bandersnatch. If you haven't read it, You should go read it. To this day, as I come into the law school each morning, I walk by Monroe's office, which is still not having anybody in it, and I still expect to see the lights on. I still expect to hear the classical music playing, and to see him sitting there with his, reading glasses and his article on his lap of whatever article du jour, and I still expect to see him there. So, thank you.
Hi, I'm Abby Smith. I teach at Georgetown Law School. I want to thank Eric Lane and Lisa Berman for organizing this, and for these fabulous photos, because here's the thing, Jen. From these photos, he's so present. He just was so present in general in life, and so it's nice to be surrounded by him here. Monroe was my mentor, co-author, yes, intellectual life partner, and member of my family. There is no one like him. He is irreplaceable. When Monroe died, I lost one of my best friends, but all of us in the legal profession have suffered a profound loss. Lawyers, law teachers, law students, as Monroe was truly unlike anyone else, a practicing lawyer, scholar, teacher, and activist, deeply committed to law in the service of those who need it most, and who very much believed in and loved lawyers. He was an unusual law professor, especially in today's academy, whose work spoke to both theory and practice, sharpening and challenging the way we think about lawyers' ethics and what it means to undertake the representation of another human being. His impact was wide and deep, as revealed by the reams of email I've received since his death, describing Monroe as a giant, a legend, a towering figure, a hero, a mensch, a true original, a champion for liberty, and a fearless example for us all. One member of the American Board of Criminal Lawyers, an organization to which he was especially proud to belong, called him the Lion of the Bar. Another referred to his exemplary strength of character and personal courage. Another said the phrase, "a gentleman and a scholar," was coined for him. Monroe was especially beloved by the Capital Defense Bar. As Monroe's Hofstra colleague Eric Freedman wrote, if any capital lawyer anywhere in the country ever faced an ethics issue, Monroe had only one question: how can I help? Although I knew that Monroe would one day leave this world, I was never going to be ready for it. Around 10 years ago, Monroe called to ask a favor. He wanted me to be the executor of his living will. I told him I was honored to be asked, but wanted to know exactly what this entailed. He said he had a low tolerance for pain. I said, well, like what, like dental pain? Then he said he didn't want to be a burden to his family. I responded that it might not be a burden, but an opportunity for those who love him to show him how they feel. He said, it sounds like you're not the right person for the job. I couldn't have been more wrong. The mere thought of ever losing Monroe was hard enough. As my good friend, and Monroe's good friend, University of Calgary law professor Alice Woolley later wrote, part of life is our resolute inability to imagine the passing of those we love. Monroe knew a lot about loss. He had more than his share with the deaths of his son Caleb, wife Audrey, and only 7 months before his own death, his daughter Sarah. I often wondered how he was still standing and still going strong. Each of these losses was excruciating for him. Several lawyers and academics who reached out to me in the aftermath of Monroe's death noted his boundless passion for law and social justice and his extraordinary staying power. He did not simply tackle a few issues, obtain tenure, a deanship, achieve fame, and call it a day. In the last few months before his death, he published an op-ed in the National Law Journal, as Jen mentioned, on the need for independent prosecutors in police shootings of unarmed African Americans, like the teenager Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. He consulted with the National Juvenile Defender Organization on ethical issues posed by certain practices in juvenile court. He provided guidance on a controversy relating to a public defender office's participation in a hip-hop video on police violence. And as Eric Lane mentioned, he organized a course at Hofstra on lawyers and social change, for which he recruited a virtual who's who of the progressive bar as guest speakers. He also finished an article on lawyers' ethics for the Hofstra Law Review. He, Alice Woolley, and I had also just finished co-editing a new book called Lawyers' Ethics for Ashgate Press in the UK. In Monroe's characteristically generous way, he insisted that the authors be listed alphabetically by first name. Alice and I have since changed that so that there is one more book in the world with Monroe Freedman's name first. Part of Monroe's resilience and his continuing relevance was his amazing capacity for collaboration and friendship. He was making new dear friends and deepening old ones until the very end. Cardozo law professor Ellen Yarashevsky has a word for Monroe's friends and admirers. She calls us Monrovians. Monroe would be the first to admit that he wasn't perfect. He had a temper. He called me up one day in the early 1990s and said we were going on the Phil Donahue show. I said, no, I wasn't. He said, your ticket has been booked and a limo will be waiting at LaGuardia to take you to NBC Studios. We were to appear on a show with Judge Harold Rothwax and the then president of the National District Attorneys Association about Rothwax's 1996 right-wing anti-criminal defense screed, Guilty, the Collapse of Criminal Justice. I swear I thought that he and Harold Rothwax were going to have a heart attack on the show. They were at each other's throats. In fact, Harold Rothwax died of a heart attack later that year. Monroe could be very fierce about his views and principles, and occasionally brusque. Some people were afraid of him. They were right to be. As NYU law professor Stephen Gillers wrote, the thing I remember about Monroe was, if you got into a debate with him, he was relentless in making his point and dismembering your arguments word by word with citations. And then he'd quote inconsistent things you said 5 years earlier, and you now had to explain. He could also be gracious in the face of an attack. When Gillers wrote a paper called Monroe Freedman's Solution to the Criminal Defense Lawyer's Trilemma is Wrong as a Matter of Policy and Constitutional Law, Monroe assigned it as recommended reading to his students. Monroe had the humility to admit that he was wrong and change his mind. However, he had an annoying habit of being right the vast majority of the time, and would not give an inch to wrong-headed detractors. As one admirer remarked, he was flexible but intractable when he knew he was right. As almost everyone now knows, Monroe was even right about Atticus Finch. I was delighted that Randall Kennedy began his Sunday New York Times book review on Harper Lee's Go Set a Watchman with a reference to Monroe's prescience. Monroe was also fiercely loyal to friends, family, and colleagues. There was nothing better than having Monroe on your side. He and I occasionally disagreed about whether Atticus Finch was a hero. I remain an Atticus admirer, flawed though he may be. Whether Judy Clark and Quinn Denver were right to fight for the life of Unabomber Ted Kaczynski against his wishes, I side with the Capitol defenders. About whether you could do more good as a prosecutor or a defender, Monroe maintained that a conscientious prosecutor could do more good than a zealous defender. I disagree. We also disagreed about the use of cliches. Monroe absolutely hated them. As a trial lawyer, I find them useful, an effective way to communicate something universally recognizable in a single phrase. But I have to admit that Monroe has succeeded in getting into my head, and I think twice before ever using a cliche, especially in writing. He was, as Stuart has already mentioned, a harsh grader. He and I nearly came to blows when we taught legal ethics together at Georgetown. I should mention that the Georgetown students were really lucky to have Monroe as his teacher for 5 years. Monroe maintained that he didn't, harshly grading, that he didn't want to send lawyers out into the world to hurt clients. I told him I needed more data to be convinced that a 3-hour in-class exam had any relationship to actual lawyering. But he also treated students with an abiding respect and generosity. Whenever a student caught a mistake he made or offered a new way of looking at things he hadn't considered, he would give them an engraved pen that read, "Excellent job, Monroe H. Freedman." Because I taught with him, I had to have my own pens made that read, "Excellent job, Abby Smith." I now have other engraved pens for my clinic students as well. These read, "Not guilty, my 2 favorite words, Abby Smith." I recently attended a public defender reunion in Philadelphia. The Defender Association of Philadelphia is my alma mater. A career defender I've always admired, named Stuart Stu Schumann, approached me to say that he had only recently learned of my association with Monroe. He said that he'd been a student of Monroe's at George Washington University shortly after Monroe joined the faculty. He had Monroe for first-year contracts, a subject in which he had little interest. But he knew he was in the presence of greatness. Monroe was brilliant, eloquent, and the most principled teacher he ever had. A core principle was that lawyers had a duty to pursue racial and social justice, a principle Stu took to heart. And Monroe looked the part of a law professor in that 3-piece suit he always wore. Stu did not do well in contracts, but he made a point of taking every other course Monroe taught. My partner, Sally Greenberg, took professional responsibility at Catholic University from a professor named Lou Barricata in the late 1970s. She remembers 2 things from the course. Her professor began every class by writing on the blackboard in large capital letters, "Don't commingle funds." And his constant refrain to students was, "What would Monroe Freedman say?" In addition to his prowess in the classroom, Monroe was a prolific scholar who wrote on a wide range of issues in law and ethics. He was not someone who wrote only because this was required of him as an academic. He wrote because he had something to say. And he said it simply and forcefully, unlike much current legal scholarship. He was gifted at coming up with pithy and provocative titles. Some of my favorites are "In Praise of Overzealous Representation," "Lying to Judges, Deceiving Third Parties, and Other Ethical Conduct." The professional obligation to raise frivolous issues in death penalty cases. And "The Public Defender and Triage, Gideon's Trumpet becomes Gideon's Strumpet." Among Monroe's many delightful personal qualities, he was the world's best dinner companion. He was a great conversationalist and a foodie long before that term became popular. He was also a terrific traveling companion. He even made law conferences fun. He was funny, quirky, I agree with Stuart, and boundlessly generous, I agree with Jen. He was a founding member of the Flat Earth Society. When asked whether he really believed the earth was flat, he would reply, "I know it is, just look." He always wore a watch chain with his 3-piece suit. He would tell students that the watch chain had great sentimental value because his grandfather sold it to him at his deathbed. When my son Joe was bar mitzvahed, he wrote Monroe a thank you note. "Dear Monroe, thank you for coming to my bar mitzvah and for the generous check. I will use it wisely and in moderation." Monroe was the only person I've ever known who actually replied to a thank you note. "Dear Joe," he wrote, "I don't want you to use it wisely and in moderation. I want you to waste it on beer and women." Incidentally, Joe is now a member of the Flat Earth Society. Monroe got him in. Alice Woolley has a son with autism who loves drumming, and particularly loves drumming with surgical gloves. Alice happened to mention this to Monroe. A couple of months later, a special package came for her son John with some surgical gloves that Monroe had found with help from one of his granddaughters, and a note for John, "From your friend Monroe." Although Monroe hated cliches, he was very sentimental, especially about his family. He was also very, very proud of his family, his children and their spouses. He was madly in love with Suzanne. and all of his grandchildren, including Rebecca, Anna, Benjamin, Andrew. He loved the most obscure New Yorker cartoons. This was another thing he and I disagreed on. We never laughed at the same New Yorker cartoons. He was a consumer of both highbrow and lowbrow culture, from Shakespeare to airport detective novels. He had an amazing ability to be occasionally bawdy without being crude. Monroe was an extraordinarily progressive thinker on so many issues, especially for a man of his generation. He annoyed my partner Sally when he first met her by declaring that he was a feminist before she was born. He was one of the least homophobic people I've ever met and represented the Mattachine Society, one of the oldest gay rights organizations in the country. He had a deep and genuine appreciation for the struggles of the poor. As Eric Friedman said, Monroe always thought there was more he could do to bring justice to the world. I want to end with one of my favorite speeches that Monroe used to say to students. As you contemplate the practice of law, you should understand that you may be called upon to represent people who, out of sheer greed, will hurt and even kill other innocent people. And if you can't handle that, then you should not go into the practice of corporate law. Monroe had a powerful impact on so many. I feel lucky to have had him in my life and in my heart. I couldn't be prouder of my association with him. He will always be the wise, brave voice in my head.
I'm going to introduce the family in a moment, but before I do, I want to tell them and all of you how proud Hofstra Law is to be able to honor Monroe's memory, as Susan Fortney made reference to earlier, and to continue his extraordinary work through the newly named Monroe H. Freedman Institute for the Study of Legal Ethics. And I thank everybody, all of you who have recognized Monroe through your generous donations, and I look forward to reporting back to you on the Institute's programs and scholarships. So now I would like to introduce the family, and we are pleased to have with us tonight many of them, and you too. And you will hear shortly from his beloved granddaughter, Rebecca Izquierdo Lodi, but joining Rebecca here tonight is her husband, Payman. Are you there? And their son, Monroe's great-grandson, who you've already met several times this evening, and who is already a fan of our president, Chauncey, which is named after Monroe's father. And I'd also like to welcome Monroe's beloved daughter-in-law, Susan Freedman, and her sons, Ben and Andrew. We welcome you all here tonight, and we're really happy that you're here with us. And Monroe's brother, Eugene, and his son-in-law, Jamie, send their regrets for not being able to be here with us tonight. So now, Rebecca, I'd like to invite you to give your thoughts.
So I just want to thank everyone for being here, and Dean Lane, thank you so much. I want to thank Lisa and everybody else who's worked tirelessly to honor my grandfather's memory and his legacy. And thank you all for understanding my son's excitement. My grandfather is often described as a titan in his field. He was the consummate academic, and there was virtually no topic that he didn't give great thought to or have an opinion on. Many of you may in fact know more about his accolades, awards, and accomplishments than even I do, and others have and will speak to that tonight. So I'd like to just share a bit about my grandfather, the man, the brother, the father, the grandfather, the great-grandfather, because not only was Grandpa a giant in the legal and academic world, he was the patriarch and mentor we all turn to in our family. And he imparted on us the value of education, the virtue of social justice, and the sanctity of family. He deeply loved, cared for, and provided for his children and grandchildren. He was the supreme role model and moral compass, and his wisdom informed and guided our family. For me personally, he was my idol and mentor in so many ways. I actually remember coming to his office at Hofstra as a child. So this is, very much an integral part of how I grew up and my understanding of like the world. Grandpa was inspirationally generous and loving with his children and grandchildren. He educated us, sending us to excellent schools, taught us the importance of social justice and making the world a better place. He instilled in all of us a deep appreciation for not only education, but also the arts, opera, music, theater, travel, and language. He and Grandma brought our family with them on trips that opened our eyes to different worlds, cultures, and people. His romance and marriage to my grandmother, Audrey, was a testament to their love for one another and their strength to overcome great odds and challenges. They met in the 40s when Grandma was at Wellesley and he was at Harvard. He a Jew and she a Protestant. They eloped and raised an interreligious and interracial family. Yep. While working on movements for social justice, gay rights, civil rights, and social justice across the board. Theirs is a passionate love story that continues to inspire us all. As a young married couple, my husband, Payman, and I sought Grandpa's advice many times. He always guided us back to a core Jewish value which he held paramount, shalom bayit, peace in the home. He reminded us that this is always the most important thing to work towards and maintain, is peace in our marriage and our home. He told his students, perhaps many of you here today, to remember that while you're a lawyer in the classroom and in the world, it is a different role that you must play when you're at home. Because the home and the family are so precious that they should be protected even from some of your best skills, qualities, and training. Grandpa was particularly close with his brother Eugene, who he adored and for whom there was nothing he wouldn't do, and to my mother, Sarah, who was the apple of his eye. I believe that it was his scholarly pursuits and his relationships with family and loved ones, particularly Uncle Eugene and my mom, that sustained him. When my son was born, we named him after great-grandpa Chauncey, and Grandpa adored him, coming to our apartment within 15 minutes of us getting home from the hospital. That was the kind of loving and connected grandfather he was, as devoted as a father. We all deeply loved and revered Grandpa, and each day brings with it reminders of our love for him and the amazing bond we had. Just want to thank you all so much for being here today to remember and honor him.